Trembling Earth. Okefenokee Swamp, also spelled Okefenokee, primitive swamp and wildlife refuge in southeastern Georgia and northern Florida. The swamp's name probably is derived from the Seminole Indian word for trembling earth, so called because of the floating islands of the swamp. Encyclopedia Britannica. 1. The Mesozoic Express. A high-pitched chop of helicopter rotors from somewhere high above the treetops, the faint, invisible perception of drifting on still waters, hot sunlight on his face and cold water on his back. An amalgam of sensations awakened Steinberg, gradually pulling him from a black well. Awake, but not quite aware, he lay in the muddy bottom of the fiberglass canoe and squinted up at the sunlight passing through the moss-shrouded tree branches. His clothes were soaked through to the skin, and even in the midday sun he was chilled, but somehow that didn't register. All that came through his numbed mind was the vague notion that the canoe was drifting downstream, bobbing like a dead log in the current of the— Where was he? What was the name of this place? Swanee Canal, a voice from the fogged depths of his mind informed him. Yeah, right. The Swanee Canal. How could he have forgotten? Up Shit Creek and no paddle, another voice said aloud. It took him a moment to realize that the voice was his own. The helicopter seemed to be getting closer, but he couldn't see it yet. Well, if I'm drifting, maybe I need to find a paddle. Steinberg sat up on his elbows, and his eyes roamed down the length of the canoe. Muddied backpacks, soaked and trampled sleeping bags, a rolled-up tent, a propane lantern with a broken shield, a black leather attaché case which for some reason looked entirely appropriate for being here. But no paddle. Must have fallen out somewhere back there. Yes, Denny, you're definitely up Shit Creek. That's a joke, kid. The new voice in his head belonged to Joe Gerhardt. Laugh when the man tells you a joke. No, don't think about Joe. Don't think about Pete. He shook his head and instantly regretted it. It felt as if someone had pounded a railroad spike through his brain. He winced, gasping a little at the pain. Aspirin. Tiffany has the aspirin bottle. Where's Tiffany? The thought came through in a rare instant of clarity. Where's Tiffany? She was right behind me when we were running. She was right behind when— Something bumped the bottom of the canoe behind his head. He slowly looked around, his gaze traveling across sun-dappled water the color of tea, and saw the long, leathery head of an alligator just below the gunwale of the canoe, slit-pupiled green eyes staring up at him. Startled, Denny jerked upward a little, and the gator disappeared beneath the water without so much as a ripple. If his hand had been dangling in the water, the gator could have chomped it off, yet somehow Denny wasn't frightened. Just old man Gator coming by to visit his canoe without a paddle here on Shit Creek. Where's Tiffany? Now the sound of rotors was much louder. The exertion and the headache had drained him. Feeling as if all life had been sucked from his bones, Steinberg sank back into the bottom of the canoe, the back of his throbbing head finding a cool puddle of water. Mosquitoes purred around his ears and before his eyes, but he couldn't find the strength to swat them away. He stared back up at the blue sky and listlessly watched as the twin-prop Osprey hove into view above the treetops. I know that thing, he thought. I was in it just yesterday. Me and Joe Gerhardt and Pete Chambliss. And now he really didn't want to think about them, especially not about what happened to them, because if he did, he might remember the sound of jaws tearing into flesh, of screams that go on and on and on. And if that happened, he might just jump right out of the canoe and take his chances with Mr. Old Man Alligator. But even if he didn't know what happened to Tiffany, he knew what happened to Gerhardt and the senator. And that's not a joke, kid. That's not funny at all. He watched as the Osprey grew closer, and found to his relief that there was a little mercy to be found in Shit Creek, because his eyes closed and he rediscovered the bliss of oblivion. Transcript of the Kaplan Commission hearings on the assassination of Senator Petrie R. Chambliss, Washington, D.C., July 2004. George Kaplan, former United States Attorney General, presiding. From the testimony of Daniel Steinberg, former legislative aide to Senator Chambliss. Kaplan: Thank you for being here with us today, Mr. Steinberg. The Commission realizes that you're involved in serious litigation in regards to this incident, so we're especially appreciative of the effort you've taken to speak to us. Steinberg: Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Kaplan: Many of the facts of this case are already known to us, Mr. Steinberg, both from public accounts and from the testimony of witnesses before you. However, there has been a great deal of confusion and, might I add, for the benefit of the press pool reporters in the hearing room, obfuscation on the part of the media. There has also been some lack of corroboration among the testimonies of prior witnesses. It's important for this commission to get the facts straight, so some questions we might ask you may seem redundant. So I hope you don't mind if, well, please bear with us if we seem to be beating the same ground that's been beaten before. Steinberg: Not at all, sir. Yes, sir. I understand completely. Kaplan: Good. To start with, Mr. Steinberg, can you tell us why you and the late Senator Chambliss went to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Reserve last April? Steinberg: Well, the senator felt as if he needed to take a vacation, sir. We, that's his staff and the senator, sir, his Washington staff, not the campaign committee. Kaplan: We understand that. Please just relax and take your time. Steinberg: Yes, sir. Anyway, Pete, that is, the senator, had just come back from Moscow after his discussions with the new government regarding the unilateral nuclear disarmament treaty. Everyone had been burning the candle at both ends, both with the Moscow arms talks and the presidential campaign. The campaign for the Super Tuesday primaries was coming up, and the Senate had gone into recess. So Pete, I'm sorry if I'm so informal, Mr. Kaplan. Kaplan: That's quite all right. We understand that you were on a first-name basis with the senator. Carry on. Steinberg: Anyway, Pete wanted to take some time off, do something just for fun. Well, he was an avid outdoorsman, and he had taken an interest in the paleontological research being done at the Okefenokee Wildlife Refuge because of his position on the Senate Science Committee. So he decided that he wanted to take a canoe trip through the refuge and... Kaplan: Excuse me, Mr. Steinberg. The chair recognizes Dr. Williams. Frederick Williams, Ph.D., Chancellor, Yale University. Mr. Steinberg, you say the senator wanted to visit the Okefenokee Swamp. I can understand that he might have wanted to take a break by taking a canoe trip, since I am an aficionado of the sport myself, but I'm still not sure of his intent. Was it because he wanted to paddle where he had not paddled before? Or was it because he wanted to see the dinosaurs? Steinberg: Well, it was both, sir. He could have taken a raft trip down the Colorado River, but he had done that a couple of times before already. And he did want to see the dinosaur project, and it was going to be in a Super Tuesday state besides, so the exposure couldn't hurt. Well, he just came to me and said, "Denny, what do you say to a little canoe trip down south?" Dr. Williams: And what did you say? Steinberg: I said, "Sounds great, Pete. Let's go." Dr. Williams: And you didn't consider this to be an unsafe venture? Steinberg: No, sir. Not at the time, at least. Why should I? Dr. Williams: I would think that you would want to ask yourself that question, seeing as how you're facing a charge of second-degree murder. The Bell Boeing V-22 Osprey, which had carried them the last leg of the trip from Moody Air Force Base in Valdosta to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, had barely settled on the landing pad when Pete Chambliss unsnapped his seat harness and stood up in the VTOL's passenger compartment. "Okay, boys, let's go," he yelled over the throb of the rotors. Before anyone could stop him, the senator had twisted up the starboard passenger door's locking lever and was shoving open the hatch. Denny Steinberg looked across the aisle at Joe Gerhardt. The Secret Service escort only shrugged as he unsnapped his own harness, then stepped to the rear cargo deck to pick up Chambliss's backpack. Gerhardt had barely lifted it from the deck when it was grabbed from his hands by Chambliss. Hefting it over his shoulder, Chambliss turned around and pounded Denny's shoulder with his huge right hand. "Come on, Denny," he boomed. "Let's go get that river." Then Chambliss jumped out of the Osprey and was trotting out from beneath the swirling blades of the starboard nacelle. Two officials from the Deinonychus observation project, a man and a woman, who had come out to the pad to greet their honored guest, seemed unprepared for the sight of Senator Petrie R. Chambliss, dressed in jeans, red flannel shirt, and hiking boots, suddenly appearing in their midst, grabbing their hands and pumping them so hard it seemed as if he were about to dislocate their elbows. Their expressions, to Steinberg's eye, matched that of the Soviet foreign ministers the first time Kamenin had met Pete Chambliss in Moscow last week. The senator from Vermont was an awful lot to take in one dose. The Osprey's pilot, who had watched everything through the door from his right-hand seat in the forward compartment, looked at Steinberg. "Is he always this enthusiastic?" he asked loudly, grinning at the young aide from beneath his mirrored aviator shades. Steinberg nodded, and the pilot shook his head and looked away. Just then the rear cargo raised open, and a ground crewman pulled down the loading ramp. A handful of men and women tromped up the ramp and walked to the front of the aircraft. They pulled down the folding seats, barely taking notice of Gerhardt and Steinberg. One of them, a redneck with shoulder-length hair, glanced out through a porthole, then looked at Denny. "That the guy who's running for president?" he yelled. Denny nodded, and the redneck nodded back. "Shit! I should have gotten an autograph. Hey, Jake, give me a cigarette." The guy he called Jake, who had a greasy mustache and wore a John Deere cap, fumbled in his shirt pocket for a pack of Marlboros. "Buy some yourself sometime, Al. Hey, Greg, take us out of here, will you? This place gives me the creeps." "Let me get rid of the VIPs first, okay?" The co-pilot leaned around to look at Denny and jerk his thumb at the open passenger hatch. "Get going," he yelled. "We got to go up again. Time to take the part-timers home and come back for feeding time." Before Denny could ask what the co-pilot meant, Gerhardt had grabbed both of their packs and clambered out of the VTOL, holding his straw cowboy hat down on his head against the prop wash. Steinberg picked up the attaché case containing the senator's communication system and clumsily lowered himself from the hatch, then dashed out from under the rotors. As soon as he was clear, the engines roared to a higher pitch, and the Osprey, Air Force surplus, dark gray with a scowling, cigar-chomping Albert alligator from the Pogo comic strip stencil-painted on its fuselage above the words, "The Mesozoic Express," lofted into the air once again. Denny watched as the hybrid aircraft cleared the treetops. Then the two engine nacelles swiveled forward on their stub wings to their horizontal cruise configuration, and the Osprey roared away, heading east. Steinberg turned around and scanned the compound in which he had just been deposited. Once, when the refuge had been open to the general public, this had been a big tourist attraction of southeastern Georgia. Campgrounds, a picnic area, a visitors' center and museum, a concession stand, and a boat ramp. Now it looked like the last outpost of civilization on the edge of the early Cretaceous period. The visitor center had been converted into a main lodge for the University of Colorado science team, which presently used the place. The concession stand and picnic tables were gone, replaced by Quonset hut dorms, laboratories, generator shack, and the chopper pad. Fresh stumps showed where trees had been felled throughout the compound, which was enclosed by a high fence topped with concertina barbed wire. Beyond the fence was the vast morass of the Okefenokee Swamp, and it didn't look like the sort of place where Pogo Possum and Albert Alligator were likely to be found. Eyeing the phlegm-like strands of Spanish moss dangling from the cypress trees on the other side of the fence, swatting away a bat-sized mosquito from his face, Denny Steinberg, legislative aide to Senator Petrie Chambliss, alumnus of George Washington University, owner of a 2-bedroom condo in Georgetown, and an antique apple-red '68 Corvette Stingray, which he'd rather be polishing right now, had to ask himself, how the hell did I get talked into this trip? Because he had mentioned to Pete that he was once a canoe instructor at a Boy Scout camp in Tennessee, that's how. And because the senator didn't forget anything. And because if the man goes to the White House next year, Denny Steinberg wanted a new office just down the hall, and that meant buttering up the presidential frontrunner whenever possible, even if that entailed going along on a canoe trip in a godforsaken hellhole like this. Chambliss was still talking to the project officials, his arms folded across his broad chest. He wore a faintly bemused smile on his face as he listened to them, probably because, if prior experience were any indicator, someone was over-explaining things to Chambliss. There was a natural assumption people made that because Pete Chambliss looked like a barroom armbreaker, he also had the mind of one. At 6'4", with the muscle-bound build of a former Notre Dame linebacker, Chambliss did have the appearance of a former bouncer. When he had first taken office, his political foes on the Hill had tried to smear him with the label Conan the Senator, until it quickly became apparent that Petrie Chambliss was no Green Mountains hillbilly. Thuggish looks notwithstanding, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was now regarded as one of the most intelligent legislators in Congress. It was only when Chambliss ventured beyond the Beltway that he ran into people who equated physical size with lack of intelligence. That was a handicap in this race. In his sound bites, the big lug came off as King Kong, trying to sound like Thomas Jefferson. The staff was still working on him, for instance, to be careful to use isn't instead of his habitual ain't. But so far the polls hadn't shown this to be a major liability. Considering that the Republican incumbent sounded like a squeamish English teacher from a prep school for girls, perhaps the voters were ready for, as one Washington Post columnist put it, the reincarnation of Teddy Roosevelt. Joe Gerhardt was standing about a dozen feet away with their backpacks, casually gazing around the compound. As Steinberg watched, the Secret Service man reached into the pocket of his denim jacket, pulled out a pack of Camels, shook one loose, and stuck it in his mouth. Steinberg sauntered over, and Gerhardt held out the pack to offer him a smoke. "No, thanks." Denny cocked his head towards Chambliss. "Shouldn't you be with your man?" The two of them had met only this morning when they had boarded the senator's chartered jet at Washington National. Instead of the normal business suit favored by the agency's dress code, Gerhardt was wearing jeans, a T-shirt, and denim jacket. Otherwise, he had the bland, unnoticeable features of a Secret Service bodyguard. He didn't look at Denny as he lit his cigarette with a butane lighter. "Nope," he replied dryly. "Not unless he changes his mind." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Remember when we took a pee break at the airport? Well, the senator told me that considering that this is his vacation, and that Secret Service protection was something that had been forced on him, he would prefer it if I didn't shadow him." Gerhardt exhaled pale blue smoke. "It's okay if you're nearby," he said, "but if you're close enough to be able to tell the color of my piss, then you're too close." He grinned and shrugged. "We aims to please." "Maybe you should be a little less considerate." Steinberg lowered his voice. "In case nobody briefed you earlier, Pete's been in the thick of some crucial events lately. There's a lot of people who don't appreciate his role in the strategic arms talks, and a few would like to see him dead before he becomes president. We've got the death threats to prove that somebody out there means business. The new American Minutemen Enclave, Gerhardt ashed his cigarette and cast a wary eye at the compound. Yes, sir, this looks just like a name stronghold to me, all right. Cute. It would be appreciated if you were a little more observant, okay? Like, do your job? Pay a little attention? Gerhardt nonchalantly blew smoke through his nostrils and looked down at the muddy ground. Looky here, son. With his left hand he opened his jacket a couple of inches. The butt of a submachine-gun pistol stuck out from the holster suspended under his left armpit. That's a Ingram MAC-10, he softly drawled. And I don't think I need to give you a lecture on its specs to show you I mean business, too. But if you don't believe me, there's a buzzard on top of that big cypress behind me, on the other side of the fence. Gerhardt didn't look around. If you want, I'll pick it off for you. Denny peered in the direction Gerhardt had indicated. The tree was about 100 yards away, and the turkey vulture in it was nearly invisible against the sleet-gray sky. Steinberg saw it only once, as it lazily stretched one taloned foot up to scratch its long head. "That's okay," Steinberg said. "I'll believe you." "Good. Then stay off my case. I know what I'm doing." Gerhardt took another drag from his cigarette, dropped it on the ground, and stomped on it with his boot before walking off. "The senator wants to start his vacation. I think I'll join him." Chambliss was walking away with one of the officials. The other one, the woman, was walking towards them. Gerhardt politely touched the brim of his cowboy hat as she passed, then looked back over his shoulder at Steinberg. "Get the packs, won't you, son?" he called out. "The man needs his bodyguard." Steinberg looked down at the 340-pound nylon backpacks on the attaché case piled on the landing pad. Gerhardt was through with playing porter. Now it was his turn. "Son of a bitch," Denny hissed. He managed to pick up two of the heavy North Face packs and was struggling to grab the top loop of the third pack between his forefingers when the young woman whose blonde hair was braided down her back and who had the longest legs this side of a Ford agency model recovered the third pack from his fingertips. "Let me get that." Before he could object, she grabbed the third pack and effortlessly hoisted it over her shoulder. "Looks like your pal left you in the lurch." Yeah, something like that." Feeling vaguely emasculated, but nonetheless relieved to be free of the extra burden, Steinberg grasped the handle of the attaché case. "I take it you're with the science team?" "Uh-huh," she replied, starting off in the direction of the lodge. "I'm Tiffany Nixon, refuge naturalist. Team Colorado's out at the Cheshire Island Observation Tower. Bernie Cooper's taking the senator and your friend out there now. We'll catch up with them after we dump this stuff at the lodge." A few dozen yards away, Bernie Cooper, a thin, balding man in his early 40s, was climbing into the driver's seat of an open-top Army surplus Hummer, with Pete Chambliss taking the shotgun seat and Joe Gerhardt climbing into the rear. Gerhardt glanced in their direction and gave him a sardonic wave. Then the Hummer started off down the narrow paved roadway leading to the side gate. Denny suddenly didn't mind. He was trading one ride with an SS asshole for another with one of the most beautiful women he had met in a long time. Things were beginning to look up. "Secret Service?" she asked. Excuse me?" "Your friend." She nodded towards the departing vehicle. "Is he the Secret Service escort, or are you?" "Him. I'm the senator's aide. He's the one packing a gun." She frowned as they reached the lodge's front porch. A second Hummer was parked out front. "If he shoots at one of my gators," she said as she dropped the backpacks next to the pine railing, "I'm going to smack him upside the head with a paddle. Come on inside and I'll give you a gronker." Bernie had the ones for the senator and the other guy in his Jeep, but I was supposed to take care of you. Tiffany opened the screen door and led him into the cathedral-ceilinged lodge. "Ah, so," he thought, as she walked down a short hallway past a couple of offices to a supply closet. This was the guide they were going to have for their canoe trip. From what I hear, Alligators aren't the worst things we have to worry about out there, Steinberg said nonchalantly, watching as she unlocked the door with a key. If he shoots at any lizards, it's going to be one of the big ones. To his surprise, Nixon gave a bitter laugh. Okay by me. I didn't ask for those monsters to be put in here. The naturalist turned on the light, picked a couple of plastic yellow cartridges the size of cigarette packs off a shelf, and handed one to him. Clip this on your belt and switch it on when I tell you. You know what it's for? Steinberg nodded. He had already been told about the reflex inhibitors. When the dinosaurs were still in their infant state, pain inducers guided by Intel microchips had been surgically implanted in the pain centers of their brains. The tiny nanocomputers were powered by hemodynamic microgenerators which kept the batteries perpetually charged by the blood flow to the brain. The inhibitors, for some reason called gronkers, also held Intel nanochip boards, wired to short-range radio transmitters fixed to the same frequency as the receivers in the pain inducers, and, once switched on, were continuously transmitting a signal on that bandwidth. If one of the dinosaurs came within 100 yards of a person wearing an inhibitor, the aversion program hardwired into the microchip nestled deep within the dinosaur's cranium automatically sent a painful electric charge into the beast's nervous system. And if the big bastard didn't get the hint and kept coming, the charge continued at quickly increasing intensity until, at approximately 100 feet, voltage sufficient to knock it cold was delivered into its brain. The idea was to allow the researchers to get near enough to the Deinonychus to observe them at close range without imperiling themselves. Steinberg knew the technology was proven and sound, but it still made him uneasy to trust his life to a plastic box. Idly turning it over in his hand, he noticed a strip of white masking tape on the side. Written on it was the name Nixon. Hey, I think I got your, Gronker. Why do you call him that anyway? Oh, it doesn't matter. Tiffany was already clipping the other unit, marked Steinberg, onto her belt. Once Denny had fastened his own inhibitor to his belt, she gave it a quick tug to make sure it was secure. They all work the same, she added. Don't worry about it. If the NICAD battery dies, it'll beep 3 times before it goes down. If that happens, tell one of us and we'll get you out of there. Just don't lose it, okay? Why do you... he repeated. Because when they get zapped, they go gronk just before they fall down. She switched off the light, relocked the door, and walked past him towards the front door. Well, you guys came here to see some dinosaurs, so let's go meet Freddy and his playmates. From the testimony of Bernard Cooper, Ph.D., Professor of Paleontology, University of Colorado, and Director of the Deinonychus Observation Project. Representative Pat McCaffrey, Republican, Iowa. I'm probably the least informed person on the commission about the project, Dr. Cooper. If you don't mind, would you please tell, in layman's terms, how you and your colleagues managed to revive 3 dinosaurs from their fossil remains? Isn't that a bit like squeezing blood from a rock? Dr. Cooper. Well, it's a bit of a misunderstanding to typify all fossils as dead rock. Back in the 1980s, it was discovered from the Colville River dig in Alaska that certain fossils contained what are known as biomarkers, infinitely small patterns of the amino acids which were contained in the original bones. Certain chemical processes are used to detect and isolate these amino acid patterns, and from them we were able to discover intact DNA sequences. The first attempts were made on the remains of duck-bill dinosaurs found in the Colville River dig, but the real success was made when the university located the remains of 3 Deinonychus at an Amoco drill site on the Alaskan North Slope. Representative McCaffrey. That's Freddie, Jason, and Michael, correct? Dr. Cooper. Yes, ma'am, that's correct. We were quite excited to make this discovery, of course. Up until then, the only Deinonychus remains to be found had been in the Morrison Formation in Colorado, so it was quite remarkable to find 3 more of this species in Alaska, although perhaps not quite so remarkable in hindsight, since the duckbill had been from the late Cretaceous and Deinonychus comes from the early Cretaceous, so really they weren't so far removed in time, considering the tectonic dispersal of northern hemisphere landmasses following the breakup of the ancient Asia-America supercontinent when... Representative McCaffrey: I appreciate your enthusiasm for the subject, Dr. Cooper, but would you please keep to the matter at hand, the revival of the, how do you say that? Dr. Cooper: Deinonychi, ma'am. Sorry to digress. Well, to make the story short, we found that the 3 fossils each had remarkably intact biomarkers, which allowed us to isolate their DNA patterns. Using bird DNA as the general mold, you might say, we were then able to genetically replicate the patterns found in the fossils. From there, it was relatively easy, although it really wasn't that easy, to clone living cells of each Deinonychus we had found, and from those cells, we were finally able to reconstruct their fetuses. It's, all detailed in the final report to the National Science Foundation, which is part of this testimony. The project reached success in 2002 when Jason was born at the University of Colorado, shortly followed by the revitalizations of Freddie and Michael. Representative McCaffrey: I see. I'm curious, Dr. Cooper. Although it has no direct bearing on this matter, how did these 3, dinosaurs get to be named Freddie, Jason, and Michael? Dr. Cooper: Well, coughs. One of the graduate researchers on the project was a fan of horror movies, and, given the rather bloodthirsty tendencies of the species, he dubbed them with the names. They seemed appropriate to most of us, and so they stuck. It was humorous, at the time, that is. Representative McCaffrey: Rather bloodthirsty tendencies. So you were aware from the beginning that we were reviving a dangerous breed of dinosaur, is that correct? Dr. Cooper: Yes, ma'am. I have to say that's correct. But we were certain that we would be able to contain them from doing any real harm during the observation period. Representative McCaffrey: You were certain? Sighs. God save us from fools and research scientists. There was a lockbox attached to the fence next to the gate, and above it was hung a large wooden sign. As Tiffany Nixon climbed out of the driver's seat of the Hummer and unlocked the box, Steinberg read the sign. Danger. No unauthorized personnel beyond this point. Enter this area with extreme caution. Stay on the roadways or the boardwalk at all times. Make no unnecessary noises. Do not smoke. Food is absolutely forbidden. Menstruating women and persons with untreated cuts or scratches should avoid this area. Wear your inhibitor at all times. In case of failure, proceed to this gate at once and leave the area immediately. Log in when you enter the area and log out when you leave. Failure to comply with any of these regulations may subject you to criminal prosecution under federal law, punishable by fines up to $1,000 and/or jail sentence up to 1 year. On the bottom margin, someone had handwritten in pen, "Please do not feed or harass the dinosaurs." And someone else had scrawled below that, "Dinosaurs, please do not eat or harass the humans." You've got some funny people working here, Steinberg muttered. If you say so. Nixon signed them into the logbook within the box. You can turn on your Gronker now. Steinberg reached down, pushed a switch on the little unit, and watched as a green status light came on and the Gronker beeped once. Nixon did the same. Then she pulled a 2-way headset radio out of the box and fitted it over her ears. She touched the lobe where the bone convection mic rested against her upper jaw, softly said something that Steinberg didn't catch, then locked the box and walked around in front of the cart to unlock the gate and swung it open. Steinberg obligingly drove the Hummer through the gate, and Nixon shut the gate behind them and relocked it. The roadway was getting more narrow now, invaded by dense vegetation which had not been trimmed back in some time. They passed picnic sites which had been usurped by tall grass and weeds. A wooden sign with an arrow pointing to the peckerwood trail was almost completely overwhelmed by vines. Through the trees and underbrush, he could see aluminum fencing and rows of coiled razor wire. The park which time forgot. "So tell me," Steinberg asked, "how did a nice girl like you get in a swamp like this?" Nixon cast him an amused glance. "I haven't heard a line like that since I quit going to health clubs." She swerved the Hummer around a pothole in the road. "Gotta fix that sometime," she observed. "I hope this isn't a pickup scene, because it's too weird if it is." "What? Me?" he protested. Yet that was his intent, whether he cared to admit it or not. Studying her out of the corners of his eyes, Denny couldn't help but to fantasize about a neat little sexual encounter over the next couple of days. A one-night stand in a tent, perhaps. The great outdoors already did things to his libido. Pete wouldn't mind. Since his divorce 2 years ago, the senator had made time with some of the more desirable women on the hill, discreetly out of view of the press, and the trip shouldn't be a total loss. But he was careful not to let on how close to the mark Tiffany had come. "This is probably much the same thing as a gym," he murmured, waving a hand at the jungle around them. "The reptiles here are only bigger, that's all." "How true." She paused thoughtfully. "I was a lawyer before this. Contracts attorney with Myers, LaRousse, and Sloan in Atlanta. I was your typical 60-hour-a-week legal droid, working my butt off to become a full partner, and unhappy as hell. All I really wanted to do was paddle a canoe around the Okefenokee on the weekends. I spent each week shuffling paperwork and waiting for Friday, when I could load up my canoe and head down here." She shrugged. "So one day I decided to pull the plug, turn life into one long weekend. And become a naturalist in a wildlife refuge? That's a switch." "I know. The partners still haven't figured it out. Ask me if I care what they think. Anyway, I had been working here for about 2 years when the Interior Department decided to turn the refuge into a research center for the project. They canned most of the staff when they closed the place to the public, but as luck would have it, they still needed a naturalist who knew the swamps, so they kept me around." Denny nodded his head, but remembered something she had said earlier. "But I take it you're not happy about the dinosaurs." "Take it any way you want," Tiffany said noncommittally. She slapped the steering wheel with her hands. "So here I am, and here we are." The other Hummer was parked next to a trailhead. She steered their own vehicle off the road, switched off the engine, and climbed out. As Steinberg got out and joined her on the edge of the raised wooden boardwalk leading into the brushes, he heard the clatter of distant rotors. "Come on," Tiffany said, heading down the boardwalk to a gate in the fence. "It's almost time for the main event." "Hmm?" Denny shaded his eyes with his hand and peered up at the sky. Was that the osprey coming back? The swamp seemed more dense now, as if the green maze were moving in around them, like the fronds of a pitcher plant curling in around its prey. "What's that?" "Feeding time," Tiffany said. "You'll love it." She opened the unlocked gate and looked over her shoulder at him. Just like a budget hearing back in D.C. It was the second time that day he heard about feeding time, but she was already striding down the boardwalk before he could ask what she meant. He hurried to catch up with her. From the testimony of Dr. Bernard Cooper. Kaplan. We realize that you're upset with Representative McCaffrey's characterization of the project as reckless in regards to the species of dinosaur which your team revived. Dr. Cooper. Upset isn't the word for how I feel, Mr. Kaplan. Kaplan. Yet you have to realize that the burden of proof is upon you to convince this commission that the project was not reckless, that you had taken adequate safeguards to protect visitors to the refuge. Dr. Cooper. Mr. Kaplan, the primary goal of Deinonychus Observation Project was not to establish a dinosaur petting zoo. When the Department of the Interior leased the Okefenokee Refuge to the project, we did our best to make sure that the specimens would be isolated from the outside world, and that the scientists conducting the observations would be thoroughly protected from the dinosaurs. Besides the fact that the Okefenokee Swamp was the most available site which approximately matched the natural environment of the early Cretaceous era. It was also selected because of its isolation. Safety was a top priority, and a considerable part of our NSF budget was spent on just that priority. The refuge was hemmed in with high fences with limited access to the swamp. Waterways, such as Swanee Canal, were equipped with underwater fences to keep the dinosaurs from swimming out, even though this species isn't amphibious by nature. Roads were blocked to prevent vehicles from entering, so that entrance to the refuge could only be made by aircraft. The specimens themselves were surgically implanted with the electronic inhibitors I described earlier. Every precaution imaginable was taken to prevent injury or death to anyone entering the refuge. Kaplan. And yet, Dr. Cooper, please allow me to finish, sir. We anticipated that we might have some privileged visitors to the project, such as members of Congress who oversee the National Science Foundation, and we were thoroughly prepared to make certain that they were safe. However, I must point out to the Commission that we did not expect that a presidential candidate might decide to spend his vacation with us, let alone one who might be a target for assassination by a right-wing extremist group. We did not invite Senator Chambliss and his party to the refuge. To be quite blunt, Mr. Kaplan, if it had been within my power to do so, I would have refused to let him in. Kaplan. Then why did you allow the late senator to visit you? Dr. Cooper. Because the project is at the mercy of congressional funding, and we need all the friends on Capitol Hill we can get. You know the old saw about where an 800-pound gorilla wants to sit. Mr. Kaplan, with all due respect to the deceased, he was an 800-pound gorilla. He sat wherever he damned well pleased. Under the rattle of the approaching aircraft, Steinberg heard the voices of the science team as he and Nixon arrived at the end of the boardwalk. Pack acquired at 310 degrees northwest, downrange 2.2 miles. Onboard telemetry good. We've got a clear fix. They're still in the trees. Okay, bring in the Osprey for the drop. The observation platform looked like a giant pine-wood treehouse perched 50 feet above the ground on the big toe of the foot-shaped Cheshire Island. A high steel fence and more razor wire surrounded the platform. Denny was suddenly made uncomfortably aware how exposed they had been while on the boardwalk. One of the men on the platform noticed Steinberg and Nixon and buzzed them through the boardwalk gate. Nixon led the way up the spiral stairway to the top of the platform. The swamp opened up before him as a vast primordial prairie. The plain of floating peat moss had been here for seemingly countless years, its mass having gradually bubbled up from the bottom of the swamp to form an almost solid surface. The edges of the clearing were fringed with pine and cypress trees, draped with Spanish moss. The prairie was covered with high yellow grass, which rippled like ocean waves as a warm breeze wafted across it. The rippling grew more intense as the Osprey came in over the treetops and hovered above the plain. A covey of white sandhill cranes, startled by the VTOL's arrival, lifted off from the ground and flapped across the prairie straight towards the tower, irritably honking their distress, until they veered away from the tower and disappeared beyond the trees. Under the canvas awning stretched above the platform, a couple of researchers were standing ready around their instruments, tripod-mounted Sony camcorders, Nikon cameras with humongous telephoto lenses, shotgun mics, a dish antenna all pointed at the prairie. At a bench behind, a young man with a goatee beard and a ponytail was watching the screens of 2 grid laptop computers on a bench, hardwired into a couple of CD-ROM data nets. The reels of an old-fashioned tape deck slowly turned, while a couple of monochrome TV monitors showed close-ups of the swamp. Chambliss and Gerhardt were standing with Cooper behind the scientists, watching all that was happening before them. Like almost everyone else on the platform, they had high-power binoculars draped on straps around their necks. Stepping over the tangled cables on the floor of the deck, Steinberg walked over to them, hearing Cooper speak in a low voice. Dropping them in just about— "Sorry I'm late, Pete," Denny interrupted. "I had to—" Chambliss impatiently shushed him. Cooper irritably glanced at him, then continued. "The pack won't emerge until the osprey's gone," he said quietly. "They are pretty shy about the chopper, and they tend to hide from it. But once they come out, they'll make pretty quick work of the bait. It's not much of a challenge for them. That's why the team has to record everything. Everything happens too fast to make many on-the-spot calls." Denny watched as the osprey settled down to within a few feet of the peat moss surface. Although its landing gear was lowered, the aircraft never actually landed on the swamp, undoubtedly because the floating surface of the swamp would never sustain its weight. The rear cargo hatch cranked open, and he could dimly make out one of the crew members climbing out to pull down the tail ramp. Steinberg ducked beneath Chambliss's line of sight and scuttled over to Gerhardt. "What's going in?" he whispered. "Feeding time at the OK Corral," the Secret Service agent murmured, still watching the swamp. "I keep hearing that. What are they feeding 'em?" Gerhardt looked at him and said, "Moo." Steinberg glanced down at one of the close-up monitors in time to see the bait being led down the osprey's ramp by the crew member, a full-grown cow, its bovine head twisting back and forth as it was dragged out of the hatch by a rope around its neck. "I don't fucking believe this," he murmured. "There's a ranch in Folkston where they're kept," Tiffany supplied. He hadn't noticed that she had slipped up beside him. She handed a spare pair of binoculars to him. "Did you know there's an overabundance of cattle in the country?" she asked softly. "This is how they get rid of the surplus. Feed stock for the dinosaurs." She smiled grimly. "They're not vegetarians, and Purina doesn't make dinosaur chow, even if they would eat it. And they won't touch dead meat. They like their food fresh, if you know what I mean." "Don't they get enough to eat out there?" Gerhardt asked. "Are you kidding? They'd knock off every bear and deer in the refuge in a week if we let them forage, and the ambient ecosystem would be shot to hell. Even the gators are too scared to take 'em on." She grimaced. "Not that the fuckers don't try," she added. The gators?" "The dinosaurs. They're eating the swamp alive. That cow's just subsistence rations for them." There was an expression in her face which was hard to interpret. There was something in her eyes which was hidden as she raised her binoculars to study the prairie. Once the cow was on the ground, about 200 yards from the platform, the crewman hastily pushed the tail ramp back into the osprey and pulled himself into the hatch. He looked like he was in a hurry, and Denny couldn't blame him one bit. The osprey ascended, twin rotors counter-rotating like scimitars, and peeled away toward the distant compound. Abandoned in the middle of the prairie, the cow watched the aircraft depart. It lowed once, a lonely sound which the shotgun mics picked up, and it made a few tentative steps across the wobbly earth, until its instincts took over, and it began to graze on the tops of the high grass. The ASPCA would just love this, Steinberg thought, as a chill swept between his shoulder blades. "We've got movement at 312 degrees northwest," the Team Colorado researcher watching the computer said. "Downrange 2.1 miles and closing. They're coming in." "Okay, it's lunchtime." Cooper absently twirled his index finger in the air. "Recorder's on. Andy, log on Dino-Ram. Look sharp, boys and girls." As the researchers switched on the camcorders and focused in on the cow, the young man behind the computers tapped codes into one of the grids, which brought a new map-like display onto one of the screens. Looking over his shoulder, Steinberg recognized the general geography of the Cheshire Prairie, with tiny blinking spots denoting the locations of the heifer and the three monsters lurking just out of sight in the far tree line. "It's called Dino-Ram," Cooper quickly said to Chambliss. "It runs off the transceiver in their inhibitors. We use it to mimic the feeding habits of Jason, Michael, and Freddy. In the collect mode Andy's running, we can instantly file new data from this day's feeding activity, then rerun it through the computer at our leisure, putting in different stimuli, weather variables, and so forth to see what kinds of results emerge. Sort of like a simulator. Nice little program." Chambliss dubiously massaged his chin between his fingers. "Kind of hard on the cows, though, isn't it?" he asked. But Cooper didn't seem to hear him. Denny was about to add his own comeback when one of the researchers spoke up from the camera array. "Movement on the tree line," she snapped, peering through binoculars at the far side of the clearing. 313 degrees northeast, and, okay, they're out of the trees. "What type of approach?" Cooper asked, leaning on the back of Andy's chair to watch the computers. "Walking," Andy replied. "They're bunched together, standard triangle formation." 3 blue dots were diagrammed on Dinoram's screen. He opened a window in the corner of the display and studied a graph. 73.3% probability that Freddy's in the lead. "Lauren?" The young woman who had made the sighting chuckled. "Good call. Freddy's still leader of the pack. Guess he won another argument with Jason." Raising the binoculars to his eyes, Denny watched the prairie. At first he couldn't see the pack. Then they moved, and he could make out 3 sleek man-sized shapes at the edge of the trees. "Damn, but they're small," he murmured aloud. "You were expecting Godzilla?" Gerhardt whispered back, but he nodded in agreement. "Yeah, cute little fuckers, aren't they?" Suddenly the 3 Deinonychus began to sprint forward, running through the high grass towards the cow. "Here they come," Lauren said as the team members operating the camcorders tracked to follow them. "They're beginning to spread out." 3-prong attack," Andy murmured, watching his screens. "Michael's heading southeast, Jason's cutting off the southwest, and Fred's going straight in for the kill." Steinberg's mouth dropped open. "Jesus," he said aloud. "You mean they're organized?" "They're not dumb animals," Tiffany said quietly. Suddenly the Deinonychus to the far right changed course, veered in closer to the cow. "Hey!" Andy cried out. "Mikey's going for it. He's going to get that cow first." "Keep your voice down," Cooper said calmly. He studied the action through his own field glasses. "Jack, Jeff, keep a camera on Michael, but make sure you follow Freddy and Jason. Don't let any of them out of your sight." The grad students behind the camcorders swiveled their instruments to keep all the dinosaurs in their viewfinders. Now Steinberg could clearly see the Deinonychus pack. Each was about 6 feet tall, with light brown skin mottled with dark red tiger stripes, running erect on muscular hind legs, slender forearms tucked in close to their chests. They were somehow smaller than he had expected, but their very weirdness somehow made them look much larger, even from the distance. Although each had a total length of 11 feet, they only stood 6 feet high. The rest was a long, sinewy tail which lashed about high in the air. He had read that they didn't weigh very much either, an average of 150 pounds, which accounted for their ability to stride across the floating ground without sinking. In fact, they could have been mistaken as being harmless mini-dinosaurs, surely not as formidable as the ruling carnivorous dinosaurs of their time, like the Allosaurus or the Albertosaurus, were it not for their heads. Long and wedge-shaped, with wide, wild eyes under bony ridges, and massive jaws which seemed perpetually frozen in a demonic grin, exposing razor-sharp teeth. One look at that face, and all notions of cuteness disappeared. These were creatures which nature had designed to be killers. Strangely, they somehow seemed more avian than reptilian. Of course they would, he reminded himself. They're ancestors to birds, aren't they? Yet knowledge of that clinical fact didn't help to shake his unease. They were too goddamn alien. By now the pack was close enough that they could be seen without the aid of binoculars. The breeze shifted just then. It was either because of the wind shift, or because it heard the swift approach of its killers, that the cow looked up. Seeing Jason coming in from in front, the cow quickly turned and made a waddling effort to run in the opposite direction, only to find that route cut off by Michael and Freddy. Braying in terror, the heifer clumsily veered again and began to gallop toward the observation platform. "Oh shit, bossy, don't come this way," one of the camcorder operators hissed. "Forget about the bait, Jack. Keep your camera on Michael and Freddy." Cooper was intently watching the two Deinonychus, who were practically running neck and neck now. Well now, let's see if they'd rather fight or feed. Freddy's massive head suddenly twisted about on its long neck, and in apparent mid-stride, it snapped savagely at Michael. The shotgun mic picked up the rasping sound of its teeth gnashing together. Daunted, the other Deinonychus slowed abruptly and peeled off as Freddy continued to careen forward at full charge. "Looks like a little bit of both," Andy surmised. "Did we get that?" Cooper asked Jack. The researcher, his eyes fixed on the viewfinder, gave him the OK sign with his thumb and forefinger. "Well, Freddy, first blood goes to you again," Cooper added softly. He sounded like a dog owner proudly watching his golden retriever bring down a rabbit. Denny looked around at Tiffany to say something, but the naturalist had turned around and was looking in the other direction, away from the killing ground. Steinberg looked back just in time to see Freddy take down the cow. He almost wished he hadn't. As it reached the fleeing cow, Freddy suddenly leaped into the air, vaulting the last few yards with its hind legs stretched forward. The cow bellowed as Freddy's sharp, curved talons ripped into the soft hide along its belly and ribs. Hot red blood jetted from its side as the disemboweled animal, its stomach muscles sliced open, toppled to the ground. Its death scream, hoarse and terrified, was cut short as Freddy's jaws closed around its neck and wrenched upwards to rip the cow's head from its neck. In a swift movement, the dinosaur hurled the head aside, an unwanted bloody morsel which landed near the base of the platform. "Oh, it's a dunk shot for Fred," Andy yelled. "Sign the kid up for the Lakers," Jack replied, shaking his head. "Damn." "Oh, my God," Chambliss whispered. He had been watching everything through his field glasses. The binoculars fell from his hand and dangled against his chest. The senator was pale. His hand was covering his mouth. Steinberg himself forced down the urge to puke. Like Nixon, he looked away. Gerhardt continued to watch, but even he seemed to be fighting down revulsion. Cooper seemed unmoved. "Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's a wrap," he said. As Jason and Michael moved in to wait their turns at the carcass, the researchers began unloading cartridges and discs from the recorders, jotting down notes on their pads, talking quietly among themselves. Steinberg watched Jack pull his wallet from his back pocket and hand a dollar bill to Andy. Some sort of continuing wager was being settled for the day. Denny was sure that they had seen this kind of butchery dozens of times in past several months, yet he doubted that he himself could ever get used to it. The project leader turned to Pete Chambliss. "Well, Senator, now you've gotten a taste of what we do out here," he said, once more assuming the aloof demeanor of a professional scientist. "Any questions?" No, not right now," Chambliss said quietly. The senator seemed to be recovering his poise, but Steinberg had never seen his boss more at a loss for words. Chambliss glanced over his shoulder at Steinberg and Gerhardt. "I think we'll be wanting to return to the base camp now, if you don't mind," he added stiffly. "We need to get ready for our trip tomorrow." Cooper nodded. "Certainly. Tiffany will escort you back. I'll be seeing you around supper time, all right?" The three of them nodded their heads. Tiffany, still not looking at the grisly scene in the prairie, stepped past them to lead the way to the boardwalk steps. Denny fell into step behind Chambliss and Gerhardt, then stopped, feeling an eerie, prickly sensation at his neck, as if someone were watching him. He gazed back at the researchers. All were busy packing their gear, talking to each other, making notes. But beyond them, on the blood-drenched killing ground 100 yards away at the edge of the safety zone, one of the dinosaurs was watching them leave. Jason's opaque black eyes were focused on the platform. Denny took another few steps towards the stairway. Jason's huge head shifted to follow his progress. All at once, Steinberg realized that the Deinonychus was watching him. Watching him. Wondering how his blood tasted. 2. Off to see the lizard. It was light that awoke him this time. A bright shaft of sunlight which hit his eyes as the passenger door of the Osprey was opened. When he awoke this time, he was lying on a stretcher which rested on the floor between the passenger seats. Someone, an older man with a balding forehead and wire-rimmed glasses, was holding his head steady between his hands, murmuring for him not to move, that he was suffering from a concussion. But he did move his head just a little, and when he did he saw Tiffany being helped into the aircraft. She was muddy and soaked. Below her shorts her legs were torn with cuts, and her hair was matted with dirt. She looked at him with astonishment as she was guided into a seat just in front of them. "Denny," she breathed. "You got out. Thank God, you got out of there." He wanted to say something of the same kind, but instead his eyes drifted from her face to her waist. She was still wearing a gronker on her belt, a yellow plastic box just like his own. His right hand moved, almost involuntarily, to his own belt, and there it was, the inhibitor which should have protected him, yet didn't. A vague memory stirred in his mind. He bent his neck a little to look down at the unit clasped within his hand. The red status light was still on. He wasn't looking for that. Something on the edge of his memory. He turned the little box over in his hand. There, on the side of the case, a strip of white tape marked with a name. Nixon. "Don't move your head," the man sitting above him said soothingly. "Just take it easy. We'll get you back in a few minutes." Someone shut the passenger door and told the pilot to take it up again. The Osprey's engines picked up speed. There was a weightless bobbing sensation as the VTOL began to ascend. He lay his head back down, feeling the darkness beginning to come once again. But an unformed thought nagged at him through the fog and the pain. His eyes wandered to Tiffany Nixon. Someone else was peering at the cuts on her legs, but he could see over his shoulder the gronker on her belt. "Here, move a little to your left," she was told. She put her weight on her left thigh and moved so that a deep cut above her knee could be examined, and when she did, Denny saw the white strip of tape on her unit. Steinberg. Isn't that weird? She's got my gronker. I've got hers. Steinberg, Nixon, Steinberg, Nixon. "Don't worry," he croaked. "They all work the same." Tiffany looked down at him then. Her eyes moved first to his gronker, then to her own. Their eyes met, and in that briefest of instants, just before he passed out again, he realized what had happened down there. From the testimony of Marie Weir, President WTE Cybernetics Corporation. Senator Anthony Hoffman, Democrat, California. As you're aware, the Commission would like to know of the details of the reflex inhibitors WTE designed for the project, that is, the so-called gronkers. Weir. Yes, Senator, I understand the importance of this Commission knowing these things. But on advice of our legal counsel, however, I need to inform you that this is proprietary information, which, if made public, could be of great benefit to our competitors, so WTE's stance is that we're reluctant to divulge the... Kaplan. Ms. Weir, I appreciate your reluctance, but you have to remember that you're under federal subpoena to testify to this commission. Failure to relinquish information, which the commission deems as useful for its investigation, could be punishable by you and your company being cited for contempt. Weir. My attorney informs me that we can give you general information about our product in this hearing and divulge further information in executive session. I believe this is a fair compromise. Kaplan. The chair recognizes Senator Hoffman. Senator Hoffman. Ma'am, the only compromise I'm interested in hearing about is whether the inhibitors you built could have compromised the lives of my late colleague and his party. If we have to put you under arrest to get that information, I'll gladly second the motion. Weir. Senator, I resent what you're implying. The inhibitors we built for the project were designed according to the University of Colorado research team's own specifications, no more and no less. They were subjected to rigorous field testing before they were put into actual use, and once they were in operation, we monitored their progress. Up until the incident of question, no failures were reported of our equipment. Not one. If you're searching for a smoking gun, I suggest you look elsewhere. Senator Hoffman. I've studied the report which WTE submitted to the committee, and on the face of it, at least, I have to agree. Under normal circumstances, the inhibitors did perform according to the desired standard. I have no wish to start a fight with you on this point. The main question which I have, if your attorney doesn't mind, is whether the Gronkers could have been tampered with in such a way to cause their failure. Weir. My attorney advises me, Senator Hoffman. The heck with your attorney, Ms. Weir. Just answer a simple damn question for me. Could have the inhibitors been sabotaged in advance? Yes or no? Weir. Yes, it's feasible that tampering could have occurred. The inhibitors can be opened with a set of precision screwdrivers. Senator Hoffman. Fine. I'm glad we're making progress here. Your attorney seems to be fidgeting, Ms. Weir. If he needs to visit the men's room, I think you can let him go now. I believe we can get some straight answers without his advice. There had been 3 of them. A small pack, although maybe much larger once, since the others had been killed by larger predators or simply died from disease or old age. They had been hunting together in a deep valley, in a place which one day would be known as, almost mythically, as Asia-America. It was twilight when the rainstorm had begun, but they were still hungry, and there was still plenty of prey to be caught before the light vanished from the world. Perhaps they were in pursuit of a larger dinosaur, like a lumbering Tyrannosaurus. Perhaps they had simply become lost on their way back to their den. Whatever the reason, they had been caught unaware by the flash flood which had suddenly ripped down the valley. The rushing wall of water was on them before they could escape. The walls of the valley were too steep for them to climb, the current too fast for them to swim. Howling their anger at the dark sky, they were torn by branches and battered by stones. In their dying panic, they had clawed and bitten at each other. Finally, one by one, their heads went under the surface for the last time. Their lungs filled with cold water. The fire perished from their eyes, and they died. Died and were reborn almost 70 million years later, recalled to life in a sterile white lab by the descendants of the little rodent-like creatures they had once hunted. Pete Chambliss's chair scooted back from the folding table where he had been working, interrupting Denny's reverie. He looked up as the senator picked up his empty beer can. "I'm going in for another one," Chambliss said. "Ready for another round?" No thanks, Pete. Still working on this one." He nodded toward the laptop computer on the folding table. "Did you remember to save?" Chambliss glanced back at his temporary desk, made a self-disgusted grunt, and stepped back across the porch to type a command on the Toshiba's keyboard. Chambliss took the mini-computer with him on all his trips. Tonight he was working on a speech for a National Press Club luncheon next week. But he was forever forgetting to save files in memory when he was working on computers. It was one of the little jobs of his aides to foresee this absent-minded quirk. "Thanks," Chambliss said. He walked across the porch and opened the screen door, then quickly stepped aside as Gerhardt came out. "Excuse me," the senator said as the 2 men sidestepped each other. Then Gerhardt let the door slam shut behind Chambliss. Steinberg fixed his eyes on the darkness beyond the porch as he listened to Gerhardt walk onto the porch, paused, then slowly walked behind him. He heard the rocking chair beside him creak as the Secret Service man settled into it. Then suddenly a cold can of Budweiser was dropped in his lap. Gerhardt laughed as Steinberg started, then popped the top on his own can. "Might as well enjoy yourself," he said. "Tomorrow night we're down to noodles and instant coffee." He took a long tug from his beer and indulged in a resonant belch. "God, I just love the great outdoors," he added sourly, propping his feet up on the rail. Steinberg picked the can out of his lap and set it down on the floor next to his warm, half-empty beer. "I thought you guys were trained to endure hardship." "Yeah," Gerhardt replied indifferently, "but I spent 2 years in the Marines lugging a gun across Central America. Every night down there I sacked out in some rainstorm, promising myself that, if I survived this shit, the nearest I would get to wilderness would be mowing the backyard on Sunday." He toasted the night with his beer. "And so what do? I joined the Secret Service so I can escort some senator on a canoe trip through the Okefenokee. Same job, different swamp. Talk about justice, huh?" "Maybe you should have been a lawnmower salesman." "Maybe." Gerhardt took another long sip from his beer. "What's your problem, kid? Still upset because I made you carry the luggage this afternoon?" "No." He took a deep breath. "I'm just upset because I'm stuck for a weekend with a raving asshole like you." Gerhardt sighed and shook his head. "Geez, try to be nice and look where it gets you." He looked straight at Steinberg. "Well, if it's any consolation," he said in a lowered voice, "I'd rather be somewhere else than with a brown-nosing little yuppie. I'm here because it's my work, and you're here because you want to score points with the boss, okay?" Steinberg said nothing, but he felt his face grow hot. Like it or not, Gerhardt had scored a bullseye with that remark. He was saved from having to formulate a weak comeback by the screen door opening again and Chambliss swaggering out onto the porch. He held a beer in his right hand, and his backpack was slung over his left shoulder. Just behind him was Tiffany Nixon, also carrying a backpack. "Let's go load the canoes, boys," the senator said heartily. "If we do that now, we can shove off a little earlier in the morning." "Sounds like a right idea." Gerhardt drained his beer, crushed the empty can in his fist, and dropped his feet to the floor. Chambliss tromped across the porch and hopped down the steps. Tiffany threw Denny a quick smile as he stood up to follow, then Gerhardt grabbed his bicep and tugged him toward the stairs. "What's the matter, kid?" he murmured. "Afraid you might get mud on those expensive designer boots of yours?" "Fuck off." Steinberg twisted his arm out of Gerhardt's hand, then walked in front of him. Now more than ever, he wished he hadn't volunteered for Pete's spring vacation trip. But then he glanced at Tiffany Nixon's backside as she walked alongside the senator down to the dock and reconsidered. Maybe a little sweet seduction in the swamp would make it all worthwhile. After all, somebody had to share a tent with her tomorrow night, and since Gerhardt himself admitted that he had a job to do... From far away, somewhere out in the moonless dark of the Okefenokee, there came a sound, a grung from a reptilian throat older than time. Denny stopped on the porch steps as it faintly echoed across the wetlands, feeling an unseasonal chill. On the other hand, he thought, tomorrow night I may want to be sleeping with Gerhardt's MAC-10 instead. From the testimony of Harlan Lloyd Castle, Superintendent, Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. Kaplan. Mr. Castle, can you tell us a little about the permanent staff of the Wildlife Refuge? That is, who works there and what do they do? Castle. Well, sir, since the refuge was turned over to the University of Colorado team for their research, the staff was necessarily reduced in number, since we didn't have to maintain the campgrounds and visitor center and so forth. In fact, we had to let go of most of our resident staff to make way for the team, so... Kaplan. Pardon me, sir. Your resident staff? What do you mean by that? Castle. Those employees who stayed in the refuge on a full-time basis, the ones who live there year-round. I was able to keep my own residence, of course, and our naturalist, Ms. Nixon, was able to keep her cabin, but our 2 full-time rangers and the chief groundskeeper were let go. Fortunately, the Interior Department found them other positions within the National Park System. Kaplan. So there was only Ms. Nixon and yourself living in the park besides the university team. Then who did the maintenance work, mopping the floors, scrubbing the toilets, cooking for the research staff, and so forth? Castle. Well, the science team was responsible for its own cooking. When the changeover occurred, I told Mr. Yamato, note, Benjamin Yamato, Secretary of the Interior, that I would be happy to have them in the refuge, but I'd be darned if I'd supply them with a concierge. Laughter. Was that funny? Well, at any rate, as for the day-to-day maintenance work, we had a number of part-time people who came in each day to do the groundskeeping and cleaning duties. And before you ask, they were brought in each day on the same aircraft which transported the livestock for the dinosaur herd. Kaplan. I see. And these part-timers, were they official employees of the refuge? Castle. If you mean to ask if they were on the payroll, yes, but I wouldn't characterize them as civil service employees. Since it was rather menial work and part-time at that, we hired whoever we could find in the area who was willing to come in for 4 hours a day. Typically we had high school kids, house-cleaning staff from nearby motels, locals who wanted to moonlight for a few extra dollars a week, that sort of thing. Again, since we were no longer open to the public, we didn't need to have folks who had passed civil service examinations, just people who knew how to handle a broom or a toilet brush, and who didn't get airsick when they flew in. Kaplan. I see. And was there much turnover for these jobs? Castle. Typically, yes, sir, there was. People quit on us all the time. It was dirty work, and it didn't pay all that well. In fact, the Burger King in Folkestone paid better wages than we did, so we hired who we could get. That's why it wasn't civil service work. There was so much paperwork involved with getting civil service employees that we managed to get an exemption from the Interior Department for these positions. Kaplan. Uh-huh. And did these part-timers have access to all the buildings, including the storage closet in the main building, where the reflex inhibitors were kept? Castle. Out of necessity, yes, sir, Mr. Kaplan. Of course, the key rings were given to them when they clocked in at the beginning of the day, and they turned them back in when they punched out on the time clock. But, yes, they had access to all unrestricted areas of the main compound. Kaplan. And that includes the storage closet in the main building? Castle. Yes, sir. There were some cleaning supplies which were kept in that closet, so necessarily they had to. Kaplan. I understand. One further question, Mr. Castle, and this goes back to what I was asking you about earlier. Just prior to Senator Chambliss's visit to the refuge, did you hire any new part-timers? Castle. Why, yes. One of our cleaning staff, Mary Ann Shorter, suffered a collision with a hit-and-run driver on the highway. She was laid up in the hospital with neck and back injuries, so we had to find a new person to temporarily take her place. A young guy named Jacob Adderholt. He answered an ad we had placed in the Folkestone newspaper, and we hired him. As I recall, that was about a week before the senator came to the refuge. Kaplan. And did Mr. Adderholt come to work on the day that Senator Chambliss and his party arrived? Castle. Yes, he did. In fact, he went out with the rest of the part-time staff on the same Osprey that— Oh, good Lord, Mr. Kaplan, you're not implying— Kaplan. Mr. Castle, did Jake Adderholt reappear for work at the park following Senator Chambliss's death? Castle. Oh, my God. Kaplan. Mr. Castle, please. Did Jake Adderholt come back to work after— Castle. No, he didn't. He— Oh, my sweet Lord. How could I have known? His oar dipped again into the dark water. He pulled it straight back to his shoulder, raised it again, and absently watched the cool water dribble off the end of the blade, then plunged it forward again into the river. The canal ran straight as a two-lane highway through the low, monotonous swampland, dredged by an industrial explorer in the 1890s in an attempt to form an intercoastal waterway before nature and lack of funds conquered his efforts. The Swanee Canal was a liquid path through the Okefenokee. Further downstream it entered the deep bayou of the swamp, a long maze, before it ended at a man-made sill and the mouth of the Swanee River. But that was a long way from here. They had only traveled the first 5 miles of the canal, and Denny was already tired. He pulled the oar out of the water, rested across the gunnels behind the pointed bow of the Mad River canoe, tipped back his cap, and wiped a thin sheen of sweat from his forehead. The early morning fog had long since been burned off by the rising sun. It was close to noon now, and the day was getting warmer. An otter had been racing in front of them for a mile or so, occasionally sticking its furry brown head above the water to look back at them as if to say, "Nya, nya, nya, you slow-poke humans," before diving and racing forward again. The little animal had apparently lost interest in them, though, because Denny hadn't spotted him in the past half hour. "Out of shape?" Tiffany asked, and he looked back over his shoulder at her. She was in the stern seat behind him. He watched as she effortlessly made a J-stroke to keep them in the middle of the narrow canal. "How long has it been since you paddled a canoe?" "Longer than I care to remember," he admitted. About 30 feet behind them, the second canoe was moving down the river. Joe Gerhardt was doing the muscle work in the bow seat while Pete Chambliss steered from the stern. They had fallen behind because the senator had been constantly pausing to scan the area with his binoculars, or to take snapshots of cranes, vultures, otters, and gators. If the Secret Service man had minded, though, he hadn't said anything. Like Denny, he had taken off his jacket when the day had become hotter, and now they could all see the Ingram gun slung in the oversized holster under his left armpit. There was also a headset radio slung around his neck. Every now and then he had paused to report in, radioing a status report to the compound. "Catch your breath," Tiffany said. "We'll wait for him to catch up." She pulled up her own oar and lay it across the gunwales, then checked her wristwatch. "We'll be stopping on a little island just up ahead, so you'll get a chance to take a breather." Denny shifted his butt on the life jacket. They had long since taken them off and placed them on the hard metal seats. "Lunch?" "Maybe," she said tersely. She was staring off across the grasslands to their right. Tiffany had been laconic all morning. When they had pushed off from the compound just after sunrise, she had done little more than to make sure everyone's gronker was switched on. Even though the temperature had continued to rise and all the men had stripped down to their undershirts, she hadn't pulled off her own shirt, which was too bad, since Denny would have liked to see what she looked like wearing only shorts and a tank top. Their itinerary called for them to make camp on Bugaboo Island tonight. Who the hell had come up with that name? Then to forge their way through the deep swamp tomorrow until they reached the end of the refuge, and just beyond that, Stephen C. Foster State Park, where they would be pulling out of the river for good. If Denny still hoped to have an amorous adventure with her, it would have to be tonight on Bugaboo Island. Yet somehow he was beginning to have his doubts. Tiffany seemed aloof today. Her refusal to take off her shirt was a bad omen. Maybe she had come to realize that she was one woman about to spend the night with 3 men, and didn't want to do anything which would seem like a come-on to any of them. But he watched her check her watch again, and wondered what sort of schedule she was trying to keep. The second canoe was almost abreast of their own when Pete looked through his binoculars to his right, and suddenly pointed. "Over there," he whispered urgently. "There's the pack." Denny looked around. At first he didn't see them. Then he did, and he involuntarily sucked in his breath. The 3 long necks of Jason, Freddie, and Michael rose above the high yellow grass, about 200 yards away. It didn't seem as if they had seen the canoeists as they slowly moved across the floating prairie. As Bernie Cooper had pointed out earlier, the dinosaurs seemed to have learned not to stick too closely together, lest their combined weight caused them to sink through the peat moss. It was almost a pastoral scene, the bright, clear sky, the noonday sun, the high grass wafting in the soft breeze, the distant figures of the dinosaurs, like a landscape painted by an insane Winslow Homer. As he watched, one of the Deinonychus, Freddie, he reckoned, since it was in the lead, suddenly darted forward, its head snapping downward into the grass. A moment later Freddie reared up again, this time with a small animal caught in its jaws, a raccoon maybe, or perhaps an otter which had not moved fast enough. Freddie's head arced back, and they heard the wet, leathery snap of its teeth as the unlucky creature was eaten alive. Then the dinosaur kept moving as Michael and Jason caught up with him, their heads slowly swiveling back and forth in search of more prey. The boys were out for a midday stroll. Don't mind us, just looking for an appetizer or two before we go have a steer for lunch. Denny was distracted by the sudden bump of the bow prodding against the shoreline. While he had been watching the pack, Tiffany had slowly paddled them to the shore. "Get out and pull us up," she said softly, pulling up her oar and carefully laying it in the canoe. His eyes widened. "Are you kidding?" he protested. "The pack's right over there." "Get out and pull us up, Denny," she repeated. The scornful look in her eyes told him that she wasn't joking, and as the second canoe nosed up into the shoreline next to them, Pete Chambliss was already loading a fresh disc into his Nikon. Joe Gerhardt, half stood in the bow, quickly scrambled forward with his hands on the gunwales to keep the canoe steady, and clambered off the front of the canoe onto the ground. He shot a look at Denny which relayed an unspoken admonition. "Kid, I'm not going to shepherd your camera-happy boss all by myself. Get moving." "I hope you do know how to use that thing," Denny muttered back, meaning Gerhardt's MAC-10. Gerhardt said nothing, but fitted the radio over his head again and murmured something into the mic. Denny laid down his own paddle and carefully stood up to crawl out of the canoe. He managed to get out without tipping the canoe, then he grabbed the prow and hauled the front of the canoe onto the ground. As Nixon began to crawl across the lashed-down camping gear in the middle of the canoe, Denny tentatively stood a few steps forward. The mossy ground squished and rolled under his feet, as if he were walking on a feather mattress. It was no wonder that it was called Trembling Earth. Watching his feet, he took another few steps, then his right boot abruptly sank to his calf in the ground as it found a weak spot in the peat moss. He swore and pitched forward, throwing out his hands to catch himself. The sharp, serrated edges of some weeds cut against his palms, making him cuss and flounder some more before Tiffany grabbed him by the shoulders and hauled him erect. "Cut it out, will ya?" she hissed in his ear. "Test the ground with your foot before you put your weight on it, and keep your voice down." "Not that it matters," Gerhardt said in a slightly louder voice. "They've spotted us." Denny looked up again and felt his heart freeze. The pack had stopped moving, and now they had each looked around, straight in their direction. As he watched, Freddie began to slowly move towards them, followed on either side by Michael and Jason. Triangle formation, just as Andy the researcher from Team Colorado had said yesterday. "This is a really stupid idea," he said to no one in particular. "Let's get back in the canoes." But Pete Chambliss was really stepping past him and Tiffany, holding his camera between his hands, as he negotiated his way through the tall grass. Joe Gerhardt moved to his side, pulling the MAC-10 from his shoulder holster and cradling it in his hands. "It's all right," Tiffany said. "The Gronkers will keep them at bay. Don't worry about them. Just try to relax." "Sure, right." Tiffany was already walking away, following the senator and the Secret Service escort. Steinberg looked back once at the canoes. An office in the White House couldn't be worth this crazy shit. But then he took a deep breath, which did little to steady his nerves, and stepped into the path made by the naturalist, as the four of them slowly approached the pack. 5 feet away from the canoes, 10 feet, 20, the 3 dinosaurs were still moving toward them, and although they seemed to be keeping their own distance, the gap between them had shrunk to only a few hundred feet. They gradually moved through the high grass like reptilian emissaries from a distant time. It was not at all like yesterday, when they had been separated from the pack by the tall platform and the security fence. This was to be a face-to-face encounter, and Denny was all too aware that Freddie was his own height, just tall enough to snap out and tear his head off. They were man-sized, but their relative lack of stature was not deceptive. These were not men, or even alien lizard men out of some Hollywood space opera. They were born killers. In their own epic, they had ganged up on dinosaurs 4 times their size and ripped them to shreds. "But they'll stay back," he reminded himself. "Tiffany's right. That's what the Gronkers are for. Team Colorado's gotten closer than this without any problems. Don't worry about it." Yet he found that his feet refused to move any further, that he couldn't look away from the pack as it moved closer, closer. Transfixed, despite himself, by their awful beauty, he barely noticed that Tiffany had paused to let him pass her. 5 feet, 10 feet, 20. The 3 dinosaurs were still moving toward them, and although they seemed to be keeping their own distance, the gap between them had shrunk to only a few hundred feet. They gradually moved through the high grass like reptilian emissaries from a distant time, towering against a distant line of cypress and pine. Ahead of him, he heard the click and whir of Pete's camera as the senator stopped to shoot more pictures. "Absolutely incredible," Chambliss said softly. Just wonderful. It's like they're just posing for... Then, all at once, the pack charged. 3. The Smoking Gun. When he awoke again, it was to cool, crisp sheets against his naked skin, to the acrid smell of antiseptics mixed with the foreign yet unmistakable odor of dead flesh, to muffled voices, and a strange pat-pat-pat of some liquid dripping onto a tiled floor. Oh, Christ, there's not much left. Do the best you can. He vaguely recognized Bernie Cooper's voice. When the feds get here, they'll want everything in situ that they can get for their... Feds? Secret Service? Jesus, Bernie! Secret Service, FBI, Interior, probably the Army and Navy, and Air Force, too, for all I know. I've just been told to keep everyone in the refuge and let nobody leave. It can't be helped, Bob. The shit's hit the fan. He opened his eyes to harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off Formica and stainless steel. The light hurt his eyes, and his head felt as if it were encased in taffy-soft cinder blocks. It was hard to think, but he gradually perceived that he was in the compound's clinic. Soft pressure across his forehead, and the white edge of gauze just above his brow, told him that his head had been treated as well. He moved his head to the right, and saw that a screen had been moved into place across one half of the room. The voices came from the other side of the screen. If they want us to leave everything alone until they get here, then why are we... Because I don't want us to look entirely incompetent. That's why. It's going to be bad enough as it is without... Look, I know they're in bad shape, but I want at least a preliminary autopsy performed before they get here. So just... I can't do that, Bernie. You know I can't. I could lose my license. A slow intake of breath. The sound of a sheet being pulled back again. God damn, just look at him. This is one fucking mess we're in. Did we get everything from the site? Everything. Their personal effects are over there. The survivors, too. And we're not to touch them under any conditions, especially not the Gronkers, although we could only find the one belonging to the Secret Service guy. Where's the... No, don't tell me. I'd rather not know. The slow pattering continued, just under the sound of the voices. He looked down, peering beneath the bottom of the screen. He could see 2 pairs of shoes on either side of the wheels of a gurney. Blood was pooled at their feet, seeping into the cracks of the white and tan tiled floor, dripping from the tabletop above. What about the other 2? Nixon and, what's his name? The senator's flunky. Shut up. He's right over there. They made it out okay. I thought the kid had a concussion, but it was just a bad cut and shock. She had to be stitched up some, but otherwise she's fine. I saw her out in the corridor just a few minutes ago. Tiffany. He had to tell someone what was going on. He opened his mouth to speak, but all he could manage was a dry, inaudible rasp. As he swallowed, trying to get his voice to work again, he heard the sound of a sheet being pulled forward again. Let's get out of here. I haven't seen anything like this since I interned in an emergency room. Where is everyone, anyway? Down at the dock. We managed to get Freddy's body out of there before the animals got to it. I didn't want it on the landing pad, so that's the only place we can examine it. More attention being paid to that damn lizard than... He heard them walk across the room, then the sound of a door opening and swinging shut. Tiffany. He turned his head again, saw another gurney parked next to his own, but the covers were pushed aside, and there was a warm dent in the sheets where she had once lain. She was gone, but he had little doubt that she would return. He had seen the look on her face in the Osprey. He had to get up. Get up, get dressed, go tell someone what he knew before she came for him. Denny sat up, swung his legs over the side of the bed, and stumbled to the sink across the room. He cupped some water in his mouth and swallowed gratefully. His throat was no longer quite so parched, his head a little clearer. He was naked. Second order of business to get on some clothes. Didn't the doctor say that his stuff was over there? He walked across the cold floor to push aside the screen. 2 bodies lay side by side on adjacent gurneys. He fought back the urge to vomit, and was thankful for the sheets that covered them. He could tell that not much was left of either corpse. There were 4 large plastic boxes on the counter under the medical cabinets. In them was the clothing he had worn, plus those belonging to the others. As he pawed through one of the boxes, groggily searching for his undershorts, he found the gronker he had been wearing, the one marked Nixon. He picked it up, stared blearily at it, then placed it on the counter and reached into another box. Here, the one Tiffany had worn, marked Steinberg. Good. He would need to show them to Cooper and the others to convince them of his story. He placed her gronker back on top of her clothes, then returned his attention to his own clothing. He was about to step into his trousers when he heard the curtain slide back behind him. Denny began to turn around when the hard muzzle of a .22 Beretta was pressed against the side of his head, and he heard Tiffany Nixon whisper, "Don't move." He gasped involuntarily, but froze in place. "Tiffany," he murmured, not daring to even look back at her. "Figured you might be—" "Shut up," she hissed. "Just get dressed." The barrel of the revolver was removed from his skull, and he heard her step away. He glanced across the counter, looking for something nice and lethal to throw at her. "Don't even think about it," Tiffany commanded, her voice raised a little more loudly now. "The building's empty, so no one will hear if I shoot you in the back. Just hurry up and get dressed. We're going for a little walk in the swamp, you and I." Denny slowly nodded his head. He didn't turn around, but he heard it creak as she bumped against one of the gurneys. As he pulled up his pants, though, he happened to look at the reflective glass of the medical cabinets above the counter, and found that he could see her clearly. Tiffany was still behind him, with the gun trained at his back. But with her free hand she had pried open the blinds of the far window, and was peering out, undoubtedly watching the people who were gathered around the corpse of the dinosaur by the boat docks. Going for a walk in the swamp, Denny knew exactly what she was implying. "Tiffany," he continued, "you don't want to—" Her face moved away from the window, and he quickly looked away from the medical cabinet. "I'm not kidding, Steinberg. Shut up and put your clothes on." Then she was looking out the window again. "And hurry up." "Okay, all right." He slowly let out his breath as he zipped his fly. "No way out of this. Christ, pal, she's got you dead in her sights." He reached for his shirt, and as he did he glanced down at the counter and spotted the 2 gronkers he had just found. Or was there a way out? Holding his breath, studying her reflection in the medical cabinet, Steinberg carefully reached for the gronker with his name written on it. From the testimony of Alex J. Cardona, Director of Forensic Sciences, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Senator Hoffman. Mr. Cardona, I think I speak for the rest of the Commission members when I say that we appreciate the hard work the Bureau has done in this case. For the public record, can you summarize the findings of your lab? Cardona. Certainly, Senator. Kaplan. Excuse me, Mr. Cardona. I believe Dr. Williams has an important question to ask first before you go on. Fred? Dr. Williams. Mr. Cardona, the senator from California does not speak for us all, I'm sad to say. I've read your draft report to the Commission, and I'm dissatisfied with one of your key findings. There is an unanswered question which interests every American. Cardona. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. How may I answer your question? Dr. Williams. Let me backtrack briefly, so bear with me. According to your draft report, the deaths of Senator Chambliss and his Secret Service escort were caused by tampering with the reflex inhibitors, the so-called gronkers, which they wore during the trip. It was found that someone, probably this Jacob Adderholt, if that was indeed his real name, had managed to substitute defective Intel 686 microchips into their units, ones which had been pre-configured to become inoperative at precisely 1200 hours on the day that the senator's party was scheduled to be in the refuge. It was because of the failure of the gronkers that the Deinonychus pack was able to make the fatal attack on Senator Chambliss and Mr. Gerhardt. Cardona. That's correct, sir, although it should be pointed out that Mr. Gerhardt managed to open fire and fatally wound one of the pack before he was... Williams. I understand, and Mr. Gerhardt will be receiving posthumous commendation for his bravery, but that's been pointed out before, so please don't distract me. Let me continue. Pending the outcome of the final investigation into Jake Adderholt's true identity, it can be safely assumed that he was a member of the New American Minutemen Enclave, considering that his fingerprints match that of a known name terrorist. At this point in your draft report, the FBI seems to imply that Adderholt was solely responsible for the deaths. Am I correct in inferring this from the report? Cardona. Sir, the FBI has not completed its investigation of the events in the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. When it has done so, we will be issuing a final report which will clarify the findings of the draft report. Dr. Williams. Mr. Cardona, the director of the FBI, has said that the final report will not be issued until at least a year from now. I am losing patience with everyone involved in this investigation, hedging their bets, and I think the public is too. You found the smoking gun. What I want to know is, who pulled the trigger? Cardona. I beg your pardon, Dr. Williams, but it almost seems certain that Jake Adderholt was the person responsible for... Dr. Williams. I haven't made myself clear, and I am sorry for that. I'll rephrase it as a blunt question. Was Jake Adderholt acting alone, or did he have an accomplice? Was a second person directly involved in the assassination of Senator Petrie Chambliss? Specifically, was it an inside job? Cardona. I'm sorry, Dr. Williams, but the FBI isn't prepared to answer that question yet. Denny stopped the Hummer at the end of the road and looked around over the rear of the vehicle. He could hear the distant aerial chop of a helicopter approaching. The noise grew louder until an olive-drab Army Black Hawk helicopter abruptly soared over the treetops, heading for the compound behind them. He turned back around to see Tiffany Nixon climbing out of the front passenger seat, the gun in her hand still trained on him. "Looks like the feds have arrived," he said. "You know you're not going to get away with this, don't you?" Tiffany winced in disgust. "Did you get that line from a James Bond movie or something?" She gently waved the gun toward the backpack in the back of the vehicle. "Sure, I'm going to get away with it. Now pick it up and start walking. I'm going to be behind you, and don't even think about trying any 007 shit with me, okay? You've pissed me off enough already as it is." He sighed as he carefully climbed out of the driver's seat and picked up the backpack, the same one he noted that she had in the canoe with them earlier in the day. "No need to knock James Bond, you know," he grumbled as he put his right arm through the strap and tugged the pack over his shoulder like a rucksack. "Besides, I'm still curious. Are you working for Name, or is it someone else? And you're expecting me to play Blofeld and spill the beans." Nixon was keeping her distance. Even if he were stupid enough to try attacking her, she could still nail him before he made anything more than a dumb, heroic attempt. "Just start walking. Right hand on the shoulder strap, left hand at your side. Now move." Denny obediently began to march down the raised boardwalk, pushing aside the last gate and heading toward the observation tower in the Cheshire Prairie, where they had been only yesterday. He didn't have to look over his shoulder to know that Nixon was right behind him. She hadn't said much to him since she had captured him in the infirmary. Once he had gotten dressed, she had escorted him out a back door of the lodge to the Hummer. No one had seen them leave the compound. Even if the federal agents were looking for them now, it would still take a few minutes before they guessed that the two of them had gone this way, and even then they might not immediately suspect foul play. As far as Denny knew, he was the only one who had seen through Tiffany Nixon's deception that the killings of Pete Chambliss and Joe Gerhardt were not accidental. He swatted aside some growth with his free hand as he strode down the boardwalk. Denny was surprised at how calm he felt, considering that he had little doubt that she intended to kill him. Would she shoot him, or maybe she was counting on the dinosaurs to do the work? Their gronkers were both switched on. She had taken the one she had found among his belongings in the infirmary, the one with Steinberg written on the tape. If his suspicions had been correct, this fact was probably his only remaining hope for getting out of here alive. "No, I'm not with Name," she said suddenly. "Excuse me?" He stopped and started to turn around, but Tiffany waved him forward again with the Beretta. "I thought you didn't want to talk to me." "It's a long walk," she said tersely. "Might as well fill the time." The unspoken addendum was, "And since I plan to murder you anyway, what's the point in not letting you know?" "But Name is involved," Denny added, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "Am I right?" A pause. "You're right," Tiffany said at last. "They sought me out because they needed a person on the inside, but I'm not with them. A bunch of fanatics, if you ask me." "Uh-huh, I see." Keep her talking, he thought. The longer she talks, the less time she has to think. He remembered something she had said when they had first met yesterday. "Let me guess," he said. "You're doing this for all the gators and deer and rabbits in the—" "Don't tempt me," she hissed angrily. Wrong words. He quickly shut up. They walked in silence for another few yards before she spoke again. "For the gators and the deer and the rabbits, right. They wanted Chambliss out of the way because he would negotiate away the nuclear deterrent if he became president. But that wasn't my objective. Having the pack kill Chambliss would help to ensure that the project would be ended. This ecosystem—" She let out her breath. It came out as a nervous rattle. "The Okefenokee isn't meant to be a stomping ground for dinosaurs," she continued. "The early Cretaceous should remain where it belongs, 70 million years dead and buried. No one should be trying to graft dinosaurs into this world. Nature can't cope with reincarnation, and if the pack survives, the Okefenokee will die. But it's research," he argued, if only for the sake of arguing. "It's searching for answers, for how many ways a new dominant species can destroy an ecological balance. Sorry, Denny, but I can't allow that to happen. I love this land too much. I've given up too much already to—" "Don't stop, just keep walking." "Hey, I love the balance of nature and all that," he babbled. "But this is kind of a drastic measure, don't you think?" She didn't reply. He licked his dry lips and forged on. "So you hope that if Pete were killed by a Deinonychus, the public outcry would—" "Cancel the project," Tiffany finished. "They'd exterminate the pack and leave the Okefenokee alone." "So you fucked with the Gronkers to—" "Not me," she said defensively. "There was another person involved who did that. Look, we're far enough along already, so I'll make it short and give you the rest. They told me that they wanted at least one survivor, someone who could go back and tell a story that would make it look like an accident. I was told that only my Gronker would work when the time came, but the more I thought about it later, the more it figured that they were lying. After all, I was the only one who could incriminate Name. It made sense that you would survive and that I had to die. I wasn't ready to make that sort of sacrifice, if you know what I mean." They had reached the end of the boardwalk now. The platform was only 50 feet away, abandoned of personnel. The vast clearing of the prairie was spread out before them. "Stop here and put down the backpack," she said. The gate to the enclosure around the platform was locked. He could tell that just by looking, but off in the distance there was something far more unsettling. Denny could see two now familiar shapes moving in the distance. Jason and Michael, the surviving members of the pack. "Hurry it up," Tiffany said. She must have spotted Michael and Jason as well. "Get the pack off, Denny." He unshouldered the North Face pack and carefully lay it down on the boardwalk in front of him. "So you made sure our Gronkers were switched," he said. "In fact, you did it yourself to be certain I had the defective one, and you had—" "Right," she interrupted. "You can turn around now. Step over the pack first." Denny stepped over the backpack, then turned around to face her. He absently noticed that her hair was unbraided. The wind blew it around her shoulders and face, which now looked older for some reason. She was not a woman, he decided, who was accustomed to murder. "You got it," she continued. "The problem was you managed to make it back to the canoe, and Michael and Jason can't swim. The minute I saw you in the Osprey, I knew I was screwed, in a manner of speaking," he impulsively replied. Tiffany smiled despite herself. "Yes, but not by you, my dear." Still keeping her eyes and the Beretta aimed at him, she quickly knelt to pick up the backpack. "I don't like doing this, you know, but of all the guys on the trip, you're the one I personally wanted to see become Dino Chow. I hate it when guys stare at me the way you did." She hoisted the pack and ducked her left arm into the strap. "And I really despise yuppies." "But you like gators." Forced humor, the final weapon of the doomed. How many yards were they behind them now? "They're better company than assholes like you." From not so far behind him, he could hear heavy footfalls across the floating marshland. Jason and Michael, the Glimmer twins themselves, were coming in for the kill. Tiffany managed to shrug into the backpack without lowering the gun for more than a few moments. "Anyway, it's time to dust off the contingency plan," she went on. "I hike out of here, and you get to be a late lunch. I'd shoot you first to put you out of your misery, but someone might dig the bullets out of your carcass, and there's no sense in leaving behind any more evidence than I have to. Mikey and Jason are going to have to do the job for me. Sorry." Denny wanted to make a smart-ass remark, but his mouth was too dry for him to speak. Tiffany backed up a couple of feet, still pointing the gun at him, then carefully stepped down from the boardwalk onto the mushy ground. The sound of the approaching dinosaurs was growing louder now. Denny could feel his pulse echoing in his ears like aboriginal drums. He glanced at her waist, saw the gronker with his name written on tape on its side, made himself look away. "Don't guess. Don't guess. Please don't guess." Tiffany was staring over his shoulder. "Gotta run," she said. "As they say in the movies, goodbye, Mr. Bond." She stopped. For a moment there was a look of sympathy in her eyes. "I hope it's quick." Then she was off the boardwalk. Turning around, she bolted for the tree line behind them, clumsily running across the trembling earth. Denny glanced over his shoulder. The Deinonychus were hurtling straight toward him. Now they seemed to have grown, taking on the dimensions of the fabled Tyrannosaurus Rex. He saw cold, crazy eyes, dagger-jawed mouths agape and drooling ooze, powerful legs pummeling the peat moss ground like jackhammers, forelegs with razor-sharp claws outstretched to grab, tear. "Oh, God! Oh, God! Oh, God! What if I'm wrong?" And threw himself flat onto the boardwalk, covering his head with his arms, and howled with what he half expected to be his last breath. "I switched the gronkers!" He kept his head down, even after Jason and Michael leaped across the far end of the boardwalk, completely ignoring him, and hurled themselves toward Tiffany. He shut his eyes and lay still as death, even when he heard the futile low-caliber gunshots, her screams, the sound of ripping flesh. From the testimony of Daniel Steinberg. Kaplan. In closing, Mr. Steinberg, I would like to extend the appreciation of this commission for your cooperation. You've been most helpful in resolving some of the unanswered questions of this event. Steinberg. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Kaplan. We realize that you have personally suffered from your ordeal, both in terms of cost to your liberty and your reputation. I'm referring, of course, to the charges of second-degree murder, which have been pressed against you by the Federal Circuit Court in Georgia regarding the death of Tiffany Nixon. I cannot give you any guarantees, but I think your testimony here today may have some favorable bearing on your legal case. Frankly, considering the continuing FBI investigation of the matter, I would be rather surprised if the charges aren't dropped in their entirety. In fact, I expect that you will receive vindication for your role in this affair. Steinberg. I certainly hope so, sir, and I appreciate your support. Yet before I leave, may I make a final observation? Kaplan. Of course. Steinberg. I've noticed that during these hearings there has been some discussion of terminating the project, that because the Deinonychus pack caused the deaths of Pete Chambliss and Joe Gerhardt, the dinosaurs should be exterminated themselves. I believe this has also become a matter of public debate. Kaplan. We're aware that the public is interested in the fate of the dinosaurs. Since these hearings have started, this commission has been deluged with letters defending their right to live, mainly from members of the scientific community and animal rights activists. On the other hand, I happened to catch a radio call-in talk show just last night in which the subject was addressed, and by a 3-to-1 margin the callers favored exterminating the pack. Steinberg. I caught that same discussion too, sir, but I'm not certain whether this is an issue which should be decided by the Larry King Show. It makes about as much sense as the proposal to rename the refuge as the Pete Chambliss Memorial Wetlands. Laughter. I don't think Pete would have appreciated that. Kaplan. I tend to agree, Mr. Steinberg. Steinberg. The point is, Mr. Kaplan, that the dinosaurs were as much pawns in this, matter as I was. If the pack is exterminated and the research project is discontinued, then in the end, Tiffany, that is, Ms. Nixon, would have succeeded in what she was trying to do. The Colorado project was begun in the name of scientific inquiry. It would be a waste to abandon it because someone tried to turn the dinosaurs into a murder weapon. Kaplan. But they did murder 2 men, Mr. Steinberg. 3 people if you count Ms. Nixon. That's the undeniable fact. Steinberg. Only because killing is inherent to their nature. They can't help themselves. They came from a different world than ours. If the pack is exterminated and the project is discontinued, then the bitter irony is that Tiffany Nixon will have succeeded in the end. The dinosaurs will be lost to an act of terrorism. Kaplan. Mr. Steinberg, you may be correct. I can't fault your logic. Yet I'm afraid you're much too late in making your case for the dinosaurs. Steinberg. What? I'm sorry, sir, but I don't understand what you're... Kaplan. This morning, the Georgia State Legislature decided that the 2 surviving members of the Deinonychus pack should be treated the same way as wild or domesticated animals which have caused the death of a human being. We understand that Jason and Michael were both destroyed at 9 o'clock this morning, about the time you began your testimony. Steinberg. I wasn't told. Kaplan. I'm sorry, Mr. Steinberg. And I believe Ms. McCaffrey would like to be recognized by the chair. Congresswoman? McCaffrey. I'm surprised by your last-minute plea for clemency for the dinosaurs, Mr. Steinberg. You witnessed the horrible deaths of Mr. Gerhardt and your friend and political mentor with your own eyes. If you had not turned the tables on Ms. Nixon, you would have met the same fate yourself. Perhaps you've had a change of mind in the meantime? Steinberg. No. I don't think I've had a change of mind, Ms. McCaffrey. It's just that, well, I just don't believe science should be the victim of politics. McCaffrey. Mr. Steinberg will have to forgive you for your innocence of youth. That is much too rash a statement. When has science ever been the victim of politics? Steinberg. Ma'am, I think you've got it wrong. The question should be, when has science never been the victim of politics? McCaffrey. I see. Mr. Kaplan, I would like to make a motion for adjournment. Kaplan. The motion is seconded and passed. These hearings are adjourned until tomorrow.